Okay, so now we have Hanno on the stage. Please give Hanno a hand.
Yeah, so this was a bit spontaneous, but we won a Pony Award for this work, and like people came to me and said, "Yeah, congratulations for the Pony Award." But what was it about? So I thought I should give a talk about that. So we discovered an attack in TLS, which we named the robot attack. So the talk will contain a few formulas. I hope nobody is scared of that, but like some basic math, but yeah. To understand this attack, we need to have a look at the Tls handshake. So if we want to start a TLS connection, what we want to get is that a client and a server, they need to get a shared secret, which they can use for encryption. And there are two major ways how to do this. There's the traditional older way, which is using Rsa encryption, and then there's the more modern way to use a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. This can still use Rsa, but then Rsa is used for signatures and not for encryption. And this provides so-called forward secrecy, which is a nice property to have. But the attack I'm talking about is about the Rsa encryption, so the older version of the TLS handshake. And this is how a TLS handshake looks like. So it starts that a client connects to a server with the so-called client hello message. This basically contains what version of TLS the client supports maximum and what encryption methods it supports. And then the server answers back with what version the server supports and which encryption method it wants to use. It sends back a certificate and a message, yeah, the server hello done, which just ends this flow of messages. And then there comes this client key exchange, and this is the interesting part because that is where this attack happens, which is, in the case of Rsa, essentially some random bytes that are encrypted with Rsa. And these are later used to generate a key. And then this change cipher spec basically means starting here, we're encrypting. And then this finished message is some kind of integrity check over the handshake. But the relevant part is really this client key exchange message. So that is an Rsa encrypted value, and this is the so-called pre-master secret. It sounds very fancy, but it's really just some random data. If we look at Rsa, so maybe at some point you have heard some introduction to crypto where you saw these formulas about Rsa, where it says, yeah, you encrypt something by exponentiating it with a public key value and then modulus another value. And decrypting is basically the same. You just use the private key instead of the public key. Now, this naive way of Rsa encryption is not really what we use in the real world. And I often also get a bit annoyed and angry when people teach this as that's how you do Rsa, because it's really not. And there's so this is what we call textbook Rsa, and it has a lot of security problems. So there's a very obvious problem with that. If you exponentiate something with the key, let's say we want to encrypt a 0. I mean, it's legit, right? Why not encrypt a 0? Well, then we see this Rsa formula doesn't do anything because the 0 stays a 0. And the same if we want to encrypt a 1, it also stays a 1. So this is a quite obvious problem, but there are other problems like essentially if you encrypt any kind of small values, you have a problem. If you encrypt things where large parts of the inputs are known, you get other problems. So that's not how we really do Rsa. So what we do instead is we use a form of padding before we actually encrypt something. And the padding that is still the most prevalent is called PKCS1 version 1.5. And this is how it looks. We're starting with 2 bytes, which are the block type, and these are for encryption just static 0002. So this is just indicating here is an Rsa encryption block. So if we're using this mode, this is always static. This is always the same. Then we have random bytes. They are just there to fill up the space. So they are just padding so that we get to a certain length. But these bytes cannot contain a 0 because there's a 0 to indicate that here the padding ends. Then we have something which is kind of special for TLS. We have a version number here. It says 3.3, which obviously stands for TLS 1.2. If you don't find this obvious, I could give a whole talk about TLS version numbers. It's a horrible story, but that's how it is. In TLS 1.3, it's also 3.3. As I said, it's a horrible story. And then we have some bytes, and these are random, and that is the secret that we will later use for our TLS encryption. So this is the kind of the important part. The rest is just basically to fill up space and have some structure. In 1998, a cryptographer called Daniel Bleichenbacher figured out that there's a problem with this way of doing RSA. Daniel Bleichenbacher asked, okay, so this decrypted RSA block always starts with 0002. So what does the server do if it decrypts something and it doesn't start with these 2 bytes? And naively you could say, yeah, okay, it just rejects it and sends an error message, right? So, I mean, something is wrong, so we just throw an error. The problem here is that we just gave the attacker some information. And we gave the attacker information about the encrypted data. Precisely, we told the attacker that this decrypted ciphertext is within a certain interval. Because like if it starts with 0002, then we know it can only be between 0002, 00, and so on, and 0002, FF, and so on. And if it doesn't start with 0002, we know it's outside of this interval. So we have some information about the decrypted data. Then RSA has a property which is called malleability, which kind of means you can change an RSA encrypted data in a way that creates a predictable change in the decrypted data. And particularly, you can multiply an RSA encrypted ciphertext in a way that you get the multiplication of the plaintext input. This is a very basic math, but it's just what you need to remember is, okay, we can make some control changes, and particularly we can multiply the kind of the plaintext that we don't know, but we can change it in a way, we can change the ciphertext in a way that the plaintext also changes in a predictable way. Okay, so what does that mean? What we need to remember is that crypto is essentially just math on numbers. So when we talk about keys, when we talk about ciphertext, they are all just representations in numbers. Numbers you are probably familiar with. So, okay, and so we learned if we have a valid padding, that implies that, so if we do this, this manipulation that I just told you, the malleability, then we kind of know what, when we know whether it starts with 0002, we know something about a factor multiplied with plaintext message. So we can look at a simple example which kind of illustrates what that means. So let us assume we have a number x, and we know that 3,000 times this number starts with 45. Then we know that 3,000 times this number is larger than 45,000 and it's smaller than 46,000. That is obvious, right? That's kind of the definition. A number 5 digits starts with these 2 numbers. So we can also calculate then what this means for x, and we know that x is between some certain values. If we know the same for, let's say, 3,010 times x, then we can narrow the interval for x. We learn something more about x. We can have a more narrow interval of what we assume x is. And if we do this long enough, we can get a more precise measurement of x. So yeah. And we can do the same with RSA. It works a bit differently because we're not working on real numbers, we're working inside this modulus. But essentially what Daniel Bleichenbacher figured out is that there is an algorithm where if you have enough of these, if you get enough information about these, whether something starts with this block or not, then you can, in the end, narrow the interval of what the plaintext is more and more. And at some point you can just brute force it, and yeah, then you learn about the decrypted value. So there are some variations of it. So I said, so the ideal attack works if the server just tells us whether these 2 bytes at the beginning are correct or not. But we also have other servers where it may behave differently depending on whether in this random padding there are zeros or whether this version number is different. So we sometimes get not directly this information that it starts with 0002 or not, but only with some probability. And then we talk of different strengths of oracles. But that, yeah. So now you may wonder, okay, how do we fix this? And of course, this was in 1998, so people thought, okay, we need to do something about it. And the next version of the TLS standard was TLS 1.0. Before it was called SSL, but yeah. And this says, okay, the best way to avoid vulnerability to this attack is to treat incorrectly formatted messages in a manner indistinguishable from correctly formatted RSA blocks. Thus, when it receives an incorrectly formatted RSA block, a server should generate a random 48-byte value and proceed using it as the pre-master secret. So the idea here is, if a server gets a wrong decryption, then it pretends everything is all right, but it will continue the handshake with randomly generated data. And then the handshake will fail later because server and client have different keys. This sounds a bit weird, maybe a bit, yeah, but that is the defense they came up with. Now it turned out this was, yeah, so yeah, that's what I just said. It turns out this was not entirely sufficient, so in TLS 1.2 the section got a bit longer. Here it says, as described by Klima. So Klima, he wrote a paper where he basically could show that some implementations, even if they implemented this countermeasure, they were still vulnerable to a variation of this attack. So one thing here that is different is that you should generate this random data even before you start decrypting anything. And the reason for that is that it could lead to timing attacks if you only generate this random data after you got a wrong block. And then it has this kind of complicated algorithm here, what you should do. But also it proposes you another algorithm, which is equally complicated. And then it tells you, although no practical attacks against this construction are known, Klima et al. Describes some theoretical attacks. And therefore the first construction is recommended. So you get 2 ways to prevent this attack. Then they tell you should use the first one, but you could still use the second one. Not really clear why, but and also, yeah, in any case, a TLS server must not generate an alert if processing RSA encrypted pre-master secret fails or the version number is not as expected, and so on and so on. And also this nice note here, however, care must be taken to avoid leaking the information to an attacker through, for example, timing, log files, or other channels. So to summarize this, a server generates a random value before parsing the message, just in case something goes wrong. Is there a question?
Oh, sorry. Since the message has a specific length, why aren't they adding some random bytes at the beginning or at the end of the message and just getting the specific bytes they need?
Sorry,
why did they choose such a complicated padding algorithm when they could just put the specific bytes of the pre-master secret prepended with just random data, for example?
I think I know what. I mean, I didn't come up with this. It's amazingly complicated, and I don't think it's a good idea. So, I'm not sure if what you're proposing would work. I would have to think about that. But yeah. Okay, so to summarize it, so you generate a random value just in case something goes wrong. If the message has any form of bad padding, then you're replacing whatever you decrypted with that random value. If the message has a bad version, that's kind of a special case. This is these two different algorithms. You can choose whether to replace it with a random value or whether you're trying to fix the version number. That has a very obscure argument in the paper. It's not that relevant. Then it tells you, okay, the second version is better, but as we like to make things more complicated and the standard longer, we give you two versions and you can choose one. Also, everything must be timing safe, and you need to figure out how to do that best. So that's totally easy, right? Everyone will get this right. And of course, as this attack has been known since 1998 and it's well documented, I mean, if you do a crypto introduction, you will usually teach this attack. So everyone knows about it and everyone has regression tests, right? That's how we do software development, right? Maybe that's not how it works in the real world. So at some point I thought maybe one should test if this attack has really been fixed. So how do you do that? Basically, you send out a bunch of broken RSA key exchanges, and then you check if you get different results. So, and it doesn't really matter how they are different. These can be different TLS alerts. These can be, we had situations where a server would send a duplicate alert, which is not really considered in the standard, but it happens. Or if you get connection resets or timeout, anything how you can distinguish between these different states, whether this padding is correct or not, you can use for an attack. The first hit was Facebook.com. So I scanned then the Alexa top 1 million. I think Facebook is number 3. Then I thought, okay, we have to attack Facebook. And then I thought, okay, it would be really cool if we could sign a message with the private key from Facebook. Because then kind of we would have cryptographic proof that this really happened. I reached out to a friend, Rsa, because I knew he had been doing research on Bleichenbacher attacks before, and together we tried to implement this attack. This attack needs several thousands of connections, so we needed it to be fast. One thing we did is we tried all the AWS locations and figured out, okay, if we use the US West Coast location on AWS, we get ping times down to between 2 and 3 milliseconds, which is very nice. This accelerated our attack a lot. Later, we also figured out that if you have a lot of short connections, you want to use this option TCP no delay, then you get many more connections sequentially. And yeah, after several attempts, we managed to do it. We successfully signed a message with Facebook's key. We have also published this message, so you can, all of you can verify that this is really correctly signed with Facebook's key. So then, of course, we reported it to Facebook through their bug bounty program, and then they fixed it around a week later. So then, after that, we always got the same TLS alert when we sent these different malformed messages. So that seemed kind of correct. Except if you remember this handshake, you see that usually this client key exchange and these other messages, they are sent together because they're at the same point in the protocol, so it makes sense to just send them all in one go. But what happens if you just don't do that? And you can do that, and it turned out if we did that, Facebook was vulnerable again. So we could sign another message. So yeah, we reported it and then they really fixed it. And what happened there was that when we had a message with a bad padding, then we immediately got the connection terminated, and when we had a message with the correct padding, it would just leave the connection open and we had a timeout at some point. Facebook was, of course, not the only vulnerable host. We discovered devices from F5. They sent a TLS alert versus a timeout, leaving the connection open. We had devices from Citrix where it was the other way around. There, in the invalid padding, the connection was left open. This was a bit annoying because we have many more messages with an invalid padding than with a valid padding, so this made the attack kind of impractical because we had all these timeouts. Okay, so what is the impact of such an attack? So, as I said earlier, there are these two different ways of doing TLS handshakes, the RSA one and the Diffie-Hellman one. And if you have a server that only supports these RSA handshake, then this attack is kind of really bad because you just record traffic and then you can decrypt it. So, I don't know, you can read passwords or whatever. However, these days, most people, is there a question? Okay. These days, most people use these more modern Diffie-Hellman modes, and then it's a bit more tricky. So then, if both the server and the client support these forward secrecy modes, then you cannot just decrypt data. You might be able to do a man-in-the-middle attack, but this is challenging because then essentially you have to perform this attack during the handshake. And we are talking about tens of thousands of connections, so getting this down fast enough that you can do it during a handshake is challenging. You would probably have to parallelize a lot and run the attack from different points and maybe against different servers. And we have not tried this practically. We believe it's probably possible for a target like Facebook, because Facebook has many servers, so you can do a lot of parallelization, but we have not tried it. Yeah, Facebook was not the vulnerable host. These are a few of the hosts that were vulnerable. I don't know, some of them I think are reasonably popular services. Maybe some of you have used them. I think PayPal has something to do with money. I don't know. Apple sells, I think, expensive computers. Okay. Then, of course, we wanted to report these things. And what you figure out there, it's really hard to track down the vendors because people are really reluctant to tell you things about their infrastructure. So when I know about this vulnerability, okay, I know Apple.com is vulnerable, but what hardware is Apple.com running? They wouldn't tell me. If you're curious, they run Citrix devices, but they seem to consider that a company secret. But eventually I found enough people who were running vulnerable servers who told me, so that we could find a few vendors. So we learned that F5 was vulnerable, Citrix, Radware, Cisco. Cisco has two different products that were vulnerable. Then we tested, of course, all kinds of open source libraries. We found that Bouncy Castle is vulnerable, Erlang, Wolf SSL. Then the others, they only kind of came out after we published it. So after we published it, then we learned that more devices were vulnerable. Yeah, and we recently prolonged that list because we found a few advisories online that they didn't tell us, but they apparently gave out an advisory. The Cisco device, that was particularly interesting. So Cisco had a device called ACE, and there the vulnerability was particularly severe because these devices only supported these RSA modes. So you had this, we can directly decrypt data. Cisco told us, okay, we won't fix this because these devices have been out of support for more than 3 years. So we're not supporting them anymore, so we won't release a fix. I wrote them back, yeah, that's very interesting, but it seems like Cisco.com is using one of these devices that are out of support for more than 3 years. Do you have a comment on that? They didn't comment on that. Yeah. What we also did is we tried to reach out to developers from testing tools, because I think one thing this shows is that people are not testing for known vulnerabilities. And I guess this is the most popular testing tool for TLS. This is SSL Labs. And if you have a vulnerable server, SSL Labs will now give you an F rating. But we also contacted developers from other tools, for example, Test SSL. TLS Attacker is written by one of our co-authors, TLS Fuzzer. And particularly it's noteworthy that before we did this work, there was no easy to use testing tool for these kinds of attacks. Yeah. We also did a capture the flag contest. So it had 3 stages. The first was we had a vulnerable host and you needed to decrypt a message that gave you the instruction for the next level. And we actually gave people a public key and said they should sign something with this public key. We didn't tell people where the vulnerable host was. We thought they should figure that out by using certificate transparency logs. That was interesting for me because many people then wrote me emails and say, hey, where's that vulnerable host? How do I find it? I just have this key, what should I do? Which apparently seems that too many people are not yet familiar with certificate transparency. If you don't know it, it's a project where it's basically a public log where all the certificates that are publicly trusted are just stored. This has done a lot to improve auditability of the TLS ecosystem. Yeah, and then the third challenge was to sign a message with the server's key. This it was in so far more difficult because the signing a message takes one more step to implement in the attack. We did not really consider timing attacks in this research. We assume that there are many more vulnerable implementations that are vulnerable with timing attacks, but exploiting these is it's annoying because you have to send thousands of messages and then do statistical middling and yeah. It is kind of public knowledge that there are some implementations that don't implement countermeasures against these timing attacks. For example, in NSS, which is the Mozilla TLS library, there's an open bug since many years, and it's kind of known that it's not fixed. It doesn't matter that much because it's a server vulnerability, and the NSS is not used that often on servers. Something we learned then is that even if you implement it correctly according to the spec and do all the countermeasurements against timing attacks that are written in the TLS standard, you may still be vulnerable to something. And we're getting back here to that crypto is just math, and our cryptographic keys and our signatures and everything, they are just numbers. And these cryptographic libraries, they use big num structures, and these are more or less just we store our numbers in a buffer with a size. That has the effect that if you have a smaller number, it takes less space. Because like if something starts with a 0, then it gets a smaller number, right? So if we look back at this RSA formula, and if you have a common key size like 2048-bit, then the result should be 256 bytes. But it could also be 255 bytes or 254 bytes when it starts with a 0 or with 2 zeros. And that gives you a timing signal. And that basically affects all the libraries out there that you can think of. We have no idea if this is practically exploitable, but it's definitely not nice. David Benjamin from Google, he's a major developer at Boring SSL. They have now are testing a fix, and they have also submitted a pull request to OpenSSL, so maybe it will be fixed at least there. Yeah. One thing we occasionally observed was that we were getting inconsistent replies from servers, and sometimes also things that looked like just garbage bytes. So one of the products was Communicate Pro, which seems to be some mail server product. They did not really communicate with us, even though that, yeah. So we assume there are some kind of vulnerabilities that, that's not mine. We assume that there may be some kind of Heartbleed style vulnerability in some products. If someone wants to look out for this, maybe interesting. So what should we really do about this vulnerability? Essentially, I think these TLS RSA modes, they are broken. These countermeasures are extremely complicated, and if you need so complicated countermeasures to prevent an attack, I would call an encryption method broken. So I think you should disable them. We did a bit of measurements on our own servers, and we think that this is feasible, that if you disable them, you will not get a lot of problems, because basically all normal browsers these days support these more modern modes that use Diffie-Hellman. In TLS 1.3, these RSA key exchanges have been removed, but you need to consider that there's still a risk left if you still support the old TLS versions, because you can even attack TLS 1.3 if you have an oracle for TLS 1.2. Yeah, in general, people should stop using RSA with this old padding mode. There has been a newer padding mode. I think it's been standardized in 2004. For some unclear reason, in 2008, when they wrote TLS 1.2, they decided they don't like that new mode and still want to stick with the old one. But these newer modes are much more robust against these attacks. So yeah, takeaways, old attacks still work, and yeah, you can even win a Pony Award by recycling a 20-year-old attack. You should stop using TLS RSA ciphers in TLS, and you should stop using PKCS 1.1.5. Yeah, thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. Do you know if SSL Labs tests for TLS RSA enabled, or does it really test the attack?
No, it tests the attack.
Okay, also with the short messages.
Yeah,
and all the
yeah.
different variations.
So they implemented what we told them.
Okay, great. Great work.
Do we have other questions? No? Let's give a big hand again.